Well, we do welcome everybody out to kind of our follow-up meeting from our joint call earlier this month between data facing, researcher facing, and systems facing that revolved around, conversations around dealing with cloud storage limit changes. University of Michigan was used as our kind of reference discussion or presentation at that point. And really today's call is meant to kind of allow us as a community to discuss whatever we'd like to from that, as well as just things in general, approaching strategies for dealing with this from the user's perspective, from the technical perspective, anything in between. So really what we'd like to kind of do is invite people to, feel free to use the chat or unmute. This is really hopefully going to be a very interactive conversation. We did not come here with additional prepared material other than we probably have a few of our own questions to kind of help with things today. So I don't know, Deb, do you want to add anything or?
I guess kind of the way I think of this being a joint call is, especially for the folks who are closely associated with libraries here. So the track that normally hosts this call is the systems facing. So they're the ones that run all the technology that your data management tools are going to be on. And so I would love to have a very enlightening discussion about kind of the challenges the library is facing that the systems facing can address, and then like the challenges systems facing has that maybe libraries can address. Since it's kind of the span of like from the user to the technology. No, actually, Brian, can you set up a poll on the fly? I'd be curious to see like how many folks are library, how many are more systems.
Sure. Let me throw something together.
Cool. Oh, Megan, that's an interesting one. Do these contracts have non-disclosure agreements, which results in crazy price inconsistencies between institutions of smaller sizes? That is a great question. Right, stronger together. I think there's a lot more talk. Working with Brian, like he's pretty plugged in to the Internet 2 cloud community, which talks a lot about this kind of thing. And at one point, at least for Box, I know there was an advisory council, but that kind of went by the wayside, like right before all the shenanigans. So I think there's talk of getting that back up now that Box has kind of like burned so many bridges. Yep, we've got a poll up now.
Yep. Answers are coming in pretty fast.
Yes. Lots of systems and researcher. Researcher's actually leading. That's kind of curious. But we have some data facing and some other. Good question. What if you fit in all three?
That's kind of where I was hoping with the primary, that hopefully one of them was more primary, but yeah, that's a fair point. I didn't really accommodate that. maybe that's a good call for other at that point if it's pretty even.
Yeah, I don't know if do Zoom polls let you do multiple choice.
It was a choice. I just did not
Okay.
choose it.
Yeah. Brian's the only one who can do polls for this Zoom account, so we don't do them very often.
Yeah, the Utah people. So actually Martin, who's on here as well, could you just have to be
cool.
a U of U account. They can.
Nice. It's mostly systems and researcher facing. There is at least one data person. I don't get to vote since I'm host. I'm data facing. And some others. I'd be curious what other is. Is that where library folks are voting? Is other? Or is it strategy folks? Some of you wouldn't mind piping up in the chat, that'd be interesting. Well, we got Patrick.
Strategy and policy, yeah.
Yep. Strategy. Oh, you don't need an HPC systems for the facing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are quote unquote not HPC that are still research systems for sure. Like the folks in libraries that maintain the repositories, I would not call that HPC.
Yep.
Yeah, Megan, that's a good point. Yeah, Megan, I believe you actually work in the libraries, right?
Yes.
They do a little bit of everything as well. Ooh, IoT stuff, interesting. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that too. But yeah, that's where I really encourage folks that are in an IT department to talk to your libraries more, because like we all have the same goals. It's just that we're at different points in kind of the research project and data life cycle. Like especially HPC centers, that's during the analysis phase, where libraries are a lot more around the publication and archive side of things.
All right, so I closed up the poll because I think we had pretty close to everybody who's going to voted. So hopefully you can see what the results were. I think that's interesting for our participation for today. So there was a message directly to me in chat that actually matches right up to one of the thoughts that that I had kind of related for today. So the question kind of goes along, you know, what are the communication strategies, processes used to work with people, you know, to kind of clean up their digital content, their garages, and get within limits, right? So as we're, you know, I think here at you know, University of Utah, when we, you know, originally had to start dealing with changes for our Google Drive, and even some aspects of the box solutions that we had access to, which weren't really changing, but just because we had people moving, we had to re-emphasize what the characteristics of the box account were. A lot of this was encouraging people to relook at what they had accrued inside their mostly unlimited Google space, so that they could live within either what they could keep in Google space after a certain date or move over to one of these others, and maybe what their buying options were. And that was actually kind of hard for a lot of the people, just because wading through some of those cloud storages is not as easy. Maybe this differs on personal perspective, but on a Unix system, I'm very comfortable running a DU and you know, walking through a directory structure and finding out where the capacity is and where all the directories are. The cloud systems don't seem to make that as easy to go and find. And so it actually took quite a while working with a number of these groups to kind of help them figure out where their capacity, where their content was within the structures that they had pushed out to the cloud space.
Could you
So we ended
explain
up,
a little bit about what DU is real quick?
so DU is just a command that can be pointed at a directory and told to kind of give a summary with the right parameter of what the usage of this directory and all the directories and files, hierarchically underneath it, are consuming. And so it can come back and give report. And there's some other related commands similar to this that can kind of give it to you in a somewhat graphical fashion and let you walk through it to see.
Yeah. And it's a Unix command, meaning you can easily use it on Linux devices and also Mac OS.
Yep.
Windows is upping their Linux game, but it's,
Yep.
I don't know. I haven't checked in on it in a while, but last time it was kind of meh.
But the file manager in Windows, when you bring that open, has some similar capabilities. When you go and do properties on folders, you can see similar kind of results in that fashion. So it really kind of turned out to where we started doing office hours and allowing people specific times to come join us, trying to answer general questions. And often those office hours would turn into almost one-on-one sessions with specific users really needing to wade through their specific needs of things. And it didn't end up being a large quantity of users. It ended up being just these specific users that kind of trickled in kind of in this fashion. And I don't know, I think those office hours end up being valuable to kind of help them feel like the problem was approachable with us. So that may be what I would add into that thought.
Yeah, so we mentioned last time at the data facing slot that Michigan used a lot of just kind of broad communications through emails and newsletters. But then for the large accounts, we reached out directly to the owners and gave them like a consultation for a personalized migration workflow.
And I forgot that part, but you're right. We did contact the large users as well, specifically around our Google Drive where we had to reduce the footprint. Our experience there is the central IT group that was kind of adminning that account for the entirety of the campus could go and pull reports fairly easily across all the user base and kind of find the top users, and then could share pieces of that list out to the appropriate departments so that, they could use that to help educate their users. So we were able to get a copy of that list for our user base and then use that as a way to kind of do targeted, contacts. And also at the same time, help relax some people when they're like, do I need to worry about this? And we could see what their usage was and be able to say, no, you're already within the limits, you're good. One of the things I'm going to make a plug for here that got brought up in the conversation at the beginning of the month, and to be fair, this is just me kind of really enjoying this tool, is the rclone tool. Deb mentioned that it was used heavily by the technical people that were involved at her side at the time. We've used this one a lot. I thoroughly enjoy it. And in fact, relating this back to my DU, we actually use this as a way, because with rclone, you can give yourself the illusion of mounting that cloud storage on a local machine. And then you can turn back to normal utilities like DU to go and walk that file system and go and hunt for certain things if the cloud interface is not giving you the mechanism that you would like to use to go and find where a file is, what the usage is, what the file count is, or otherwise. So we got pretty creative with a few of the users trying to help them solve the problems in that way. And then just kind of kept the notes of what we were doing for them, shared them out with our user services group. Anita Rent was kind of leading that, so that she kind of knew these things as she was having conversations, and other user services were having conversations with other users to kind of know if somebody else asked for something, they kind of knew these things that we could go and potentially help them with as well. Because yeah, it was something we were learning as we went along, and I see that the link to rClone was shared there in the chat. I know what I guess I'd make the plug. What other sites have already gone through something like this or are anticipating going through something like this, having to, for one reason or another, shift from one cloud storage solution to another, whether it's because the contracts changed, capacity limits have changed, or something else?
Brian, I could have given that talk that they gave, because we went through the exact same experience at Penn State. We had I think we started with something like 196,000 accounts in Box, and we had to get, and a lot of them were, you know, people had never activated them or whatever, but we actually had about 92,000 that we had to migrate. And it did come down to sort of like about 200 use cases, you know, users, and they were mostly research cases that we just had to sit down and say, what are you doing? You know, how, and a lot of times what it resulted was we had to modify their workflow. We not only had to migrate the data, but we had to modify their workflow that had become so dependent upon the tools for Box, or the, you know, our cloning things or our syncing things into Box. And it was just a real rush. I mean, it took us almost 18 months to get all of the researchers off. We had a cryo-EM group that, and they mostly self-migrated, but they had almost a petabyte of data in Box. So at the peak, we had about 3 petabytes of data in Box, and they were responsible for just over a third of it. And fortunately, they self-migrated, but we had to use, we bought the Mover tool that's specific for, it used to be a more general tool, and I think Microsoft acquired it. And so it's specifically moving it from other cloud storage solutions into OneDrive or SharePoint. And we also use the Globus tool, because we moved some of it onto like high performance storage on our clusters, and we moved some of it into the cloud, and we, you know, so it was a variety of solutions, and we used the data storage finder. I think Cornell, I think we got the source code from Cornell, but I think Michigan uses it and Michigan State uses it. And it's just you know, put in the size of your data and the requirements on it, how quickly you need it, you know, what level of security's on it. And we'll find a couple solutions from our, you know, 12 or so storage solutions that might fit what you're doing. So it was a real, it was mostly about workflows when we got to the last 200. It really wasn't about migrating per se, although there was a lot of migration involved.
Yeah, oh, I know the storage finder tool you're talking about. It's pretty ubiquitous from what I'm seeing, but I don't like it. It's too simple. Like, so I come from a physicsy background, quantum chemistry. So I talk very mathy. I think of data storage as being 4-dimensional. Like, you have to take time into account, because that's where losing these cloud platforms is a really big blow, is because they were one place for like the whole data lifecycle. And now that that's not a thing anymore, there isn't really one thing that can serve the whole life cycle. Yeah, but yeah, so Penn State came off of Box. Where'd you go to?
Well, we went everywhere. some of the stuff went into the Google Drive, and then we realized that we had to get down, like Brian was saying, we had to get down below certain thresholds by certain time. So we're migrating some of those people out where their IT directors had migrated them into Google. A lot of it ended up on in OneDrive and SharePoint sites, and that's really not that great for research data. And a couple of reasons are the limitations on the naming size. So the whole path length has to be fewer than 400 characters. And I think we tie up the first 45 in the Penn. Somebody thought it would be smart to call it the Pennsylvania State University instead of PSU. So we tie up the first, 45 characters in the name of the storage, and then researchers who tend to use, build out okay, this was done on this date, on this instrument, and this parameters, and use the file system structure to provide metadata for the data that they're collecting. A lot of them had to modify names to fit into those Microsoft limitations. And then at the time, I think when we were first starting to migrate, you could only put a file, a 32 gigabit or gigabyte file into the OneDrive, and that wasn't enough for a lot of these like CT files and cryo-EM files. So we ended up putting some on high performance storage, but a lot of times that isn't a very good match either, because you're paying a lot for that to not use it that often. And some people we contracted with Wasabi, which is sort of it's a AWS sort of storage equivalent, but it's only a storage play in the cloud. So the AWS APIs, particularly the S3 APIs, work to access those, but it's a separate company. And if you're using Globus, the Globus S3 connector works perfectly fine with Wasabi. So we've moved some people off to that. We use some people off to Glacier, and then the cryo-EM people moved to the unlimited storage of Dropbox, which, it is unlimited for as long as it's unlimited, and past track records have shown that's not going to last very long.
Yeah, I'm with you there. That's what happened at Arizona State, where I am now, is pretty much everyone went from Drive to Dropbox. And at Michigan, actually, for folks who didn't go to Dropbox, a lot of them went to Google Drive, and now Michigan is trying to decrease its drive. And if your institution is large enough to do this, I really think you should just take it all out of the cloud, except for true collaboration cases. Because this is a lot of time spent doing tasks that don't push research forward.
And I feel like there's things that get lost in the process, that there is not a good way to capture, recreate, to preserve, such as a lot of these have the ability to have revisions of files. So the fact that you had a file that was an evolving living file over there that you and your collaborators were building into, when you pull that file out, you just pulled a current instance or a specific aged instance of it out. You didn't bring the whole history out. So as you push it into the other side, it's just that single point in time, and you've lost that history. Same with, going in and how you have it shared, who you have it shared to, somewhat even some of the ownerships, because you may have read access, so you might be able to pull it out, but as you push it back in, you're likely pushing it back in as a single personality into the other end. and trying to go back and recreate that, let alone even, itemize and capture that at the other end. That feels like a really unfortunately complicated, nearly unsolvable problem without pouring just tons of hours at it.
DJ, did you want to say something?
Oh, yeah, it's just interesting, similar issue here at our university. We are also moving off of Google because they cut our quota down. And I was just wondering how you're handling, we have some researchers, the reason why they're using Google is because they're collaborating with other researchers at other universities and they don't have Microsoft. And so if we tell them you have to move over to SharePoint, how am I going to work? So I'd like to know how others are treating that. What we've done is we've tried to talk to them and say, well, not all your data on Google is active, right? So let's take that off the table and move it over to SharePoint and just leave your active data. So as just thoughts of what others are doing in that area to work with the researchers.
That is a lot of the conversation we had at Michigan with folks we reached out to was like, how much of this do you actually need to share outside the university right now? And let's see about putting the rest of it somewhere else. And so now when I have subsequent storage conversations with anyone, that's always on my mind.
Mhm.
It may not be applicable to many of the cases, but both Google and Amazon do occasionally remind you that if the type of data you're working on is generally valuable to a broader community, you can approach them about hosting it kind of for free. But it has to qualify in these right ways. And all I've been on is at the receiving end of this message, not ever being at the end of, hey, we found one of these pieces of data that we can go and put forth in front of them and say, it's valuable to this broad piece of community. You guys should host it. But that is at least one angle to kind of consider if it is broadly desirable by a large piece of community
Mhm.
you could explore.
All right. And I just wanted to say, we also used the Arclone tool, but we also used another tool called mover.io in our attempts to get data off. That also seemed to work pretty well.
Yeah, that was the tool that I was talking about, the mover.
Okay.
It used to be a way of going between cloud platforms, and then I think Microsoft acquired it and it became a way of moving stuff onto Office 365 storage. So, but since that's what we were doing, it turned out to be a pretty valuable tool.
Megan, to your kind of last comment there in the chat, I'm under the impression it's more for published data sets, but I don't know
Okay.
that's a hard set rule.
Yeah, as the storage crunches continue across all platforms, this is something I think we're all going to have to start becoming better versed in.
One of my biggest worries with this whole problem is as contracts are made and they have their life cycle, I worry that each time the renewal comes up, whoever you were with might want a little more. That's subjective what that means. And somebody else will want your business and will offer you a little bit less. And all that will happen is each time we renew, we'll just see this process happen again. And I really don't want to go through this process every 3 to 5 years. That's my biggest worry, sitting in the system side. And I'm sure that's not unique to the systems perspective. That's going to be a common from the entirety of everything that we represent here. But I don't know how to avoid that problem if that proves to actually occur.
Maybe we should try fully costing migration efforts. Like, seriously.
That's not a bad thought.
That's
a
what my
really
boss
good
said.
idea, Dan.
Yeah, that's what my boss said 18 months after we started doing it.
It's unfortunate that often the people, at least at our university, that seem to be involved in figuring out contracts are oblivious, completely oblivious to the impact on everyday life that they're causing by saving enough money or making it fit within budget, which is always a very real thing. You've only got X dollars this year and we have to make everything work. So I guess then the question becomes, how do we get the people who are at that level to understand that it's not just how much you're paying vendor, it's how much of your people's time was taken away from their primary task to accomplish the shift. That's the total cost.
Right, because that kind of relates to another question I was curious about, like, how long were universities planning these migrations? Like at Michigan, it was fully 2 years. And Brian said it was 18 months at Utah.
Yeah, but Anita's on the call here. I'm gonna actually plug her. How long did we actually get, Anita? From when we kind of did that head start to when?
It sort of died off, so I don't know that I have a clear answer to that.
I
was
think
tying
campus though
it
was,
back. But, they extended it, and from what I understand, there was an issue at the Google end where they couldn't set these quotas, so there was sort of a lot of lag behind it. But we were given probably, 6 to 12 months that we were really working with the users.
but I think on paper, when we look at the beginning of that, I think the people who were making these decisions did not plan for 6 to 12 months. I think they were planning for 3, maybe to 6 months, which was way too narrow of a time window. Now, because of these other quirks, in the technical side and various other things, it got allowed to kind of extend out and became a little bit more realistic. But I don't think they had a realistic view of the effort up front.
I'm looking back through my notes. We started in February with a goal that we were supposed to be off July.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the time window that we at least initially started working with users.
The comment of capturing the the cost aspects of the migration, and I think going back to Deb, one of your earlier comments, the value proposition of being able to data lifecycle the content in a single place with the characteristics, that one cloud platform, whichever one it is, right, can offer that data through its entire lifecycle, there has to be valued in a little bit more than it appears to be right now.
When Alan made a really good comment in the chat that I'd love to expand on more. Basically, the funding agencies that are mandating the data retention don't fund it. Like I've dealt with mostly NIH, and they specifically have on their guidelines, like, you have to pay for your archive storage before the grant ends. Which at Michigan, our finance people wouldn't let them do that. So rock and a hard place. And that's where I would really love to get NSF to do more with storage, which I know that still has similar problems, but like I've only ever worked at R1s, so I'm privileged that way, and our solutions are just, let's build on-prem storage and make all sorts of cool software to make transitioning between the devices easy. But like, most institutions don't have that kind of funding. And to be frank, what good is having these gigantic clusters if you can't store the data that they generate?
Yeah, I'll follow that up and say that this is one of the reasons that many years ago we stopped allowing researchers to buy their own storage and stick it in our data center. Because, you know, from the researcher's point of view, I mean, these are fundamentally scientists, and their attitude towards something is, once I discover it, it's there forever, right? It works in science, it doesn't work with hardware. So they never understand that their, you know, 6-year-old storage array that we let them put in is not going to work anymore, and they get very upset. So we just stopped doing that. We let them buy in onto our storage on an annual basis, and that's that. So far, we haven't had to have any difficult conversations with people whose funding had expired, but we expect to.
But to that point, I think that necessarily means we also need to talk to the research publishing industry, because they allow results to be called into question indefinitely. And that's just not sustainable. And I think that's what most researchers worry about when they hoard their data.
Yeah, we unfortunately lost the Globus Publish, which was, in my view, the best attempt to take on the whole data production to publishing life cycle. This code is still open source, but since we lost Steve Tiki, I don't think we had anyone else take it up. That had done the best job of actually speaking, you know, librarians' language and understanding the way that they thought. You know, librarians are the ones who ought to be curating data, and we ought to approach it as we'd approach any product of scholarship. You know, in what world would you be allowed to publish a paper that would become inaccessible after a year, right? But data, somehow people have this attitude that, oh, you know, if I'm not using that data set anymore, I can just make it go away. Never mind what commitment I've made to the journal that I published in or whatever. And those commitments are, of course, not as prevalent as they should be. Yeah. Yeah, so I put in a, you know, attempt to make light of it, but it's a serious thing. And just as you tell someone not to get a puppy for Christmas unless they're committed to taking care of it, you know, we should say, don't make the data, don't publish it if you're not committed to maintaining it. But how do you make that work in the unfunded mandate world that we're living in?
All right, another question in the chat. How many folks have started to build on-premise storage rather than moving data around the clouds? Michigan and Arizona State both.
So Utah has some, but there are challenges and growing pains there too. At least I think we see them from the systems people's perspective, and we talk with our user services people about these parts too, which is, you know, if I just waded into a little bit the weeds for a moment, we have a Ceph implementation that has a lot of the S3 characteristics, you know, of Amazon's storage. And so it has some of the niceties of that that are attractive. Some of the data resiliency, elements that the cloud brings in, but it's all at one data center. So it doesn't quite have the durability characteristics that some of the cloud providers can have by spreading your data across lots of different data centers. And for us to go and approach that starts to challenge, the on-prem cost model a little bit, or at least for us right now, the way we're looking at that. So it's making us rethink how we can approach some of these problems to try to address this. And we have some ideas, I guess, that we're toying with, but there's no funding in hand to approach them. But that I guess is one of our worries is yes, we can go and make on-prem storage and we can give it some good characteristics, but it doesn't quite have some of the bonus points that some of the cloud providers can offer with, again, their multi-site characteristics. So it's really kind of hard to be equivalent. So that's maybe where I leave that. I see there are some other comments being added into the chat.
As I say, we find that our problem isn't the people wanting to put stuff in the cloud. Our problem is people wanting to put stuff on USB drives. So we have the opposite problem. It's like, want to go as cheap as possible, spend as little money as possible, and then, well, that's not a good plan either. So we need to make our own offerings competitive.
Yeah, the 12T USB drive sitting in a corner as your backup device for long-term storage isn't really such the greatest thing. You have a valid point there.
So I see Kurt made a comment, working with other universities. That's kind of one of the things we've toyed around with too, is looking at other locations within our region, our state, to see whether or not, a little horse trading between data center locations and a little bit of a collaboration, but it's not really gotten beyond just interesting talk and maybe at least an acknowledgement that one or more of the other sites could be interested if we wanted to talk about this more. But we haven't hit anything more significant than that.
Ooh, David, I would like to hear a little more about your research data storage platform.
Well, I guess we had the problem that, people were using USB drives and bare drives and Synologies in closets that would get rained on and things like that. So we got some funding from the Vice President for Research and threw together a research data storage solution. It's, I don't know, I think it's currently 1.3 petabytes of Cumulo storage. And we require people to have a data management plan before they can use it. The cost point for entry is you get 1 terabyte free if you're a researcher. And in theory, we were going to charge $25 per terabyte per year. Beyond that, I don't think we're actually doing that yet, but that's kind of the plan. And that pricing was basically to compete against those, bare drives from the big box store that are plugged in via USB or whatever in back of your the PC or Mac that's on your desk. But the catch is that that's really only for active research data, and it is backed up, I believe, quarterly for disaster recovery. So it's not a full solution, but it's better than that aging Synology in the closet with the drives that are starting to fail. And it's explicitly not for archiving or for use as a repository. It's, within the campus firewall. So, you can generate mount points for labs and things like that, which is very useful. But, and you can also move data back and forth between it and the HPC and elsewhere using the, the Science DMZ and Globus and things like that. So it's a partial solution. But I guess a lot of the problems that people are facing, also have to do with archiving and repository issues. So this, explicitly does not solve those. Is that useful?
Yes, that is fantastic. Thanks. I'm also trying to take notes.
I have a question for you, David.
Sure, go ahead.
So I'm a librarian who manages a repository, and you said like your storage facility is not built for archiving, but if the library bought space on your system, is it because it can't serve out to the public that it's not for archiving, or is it just not built for long term?
Yeah, no, it's it cannot serve out to the public is the answer. And of course, we're working very closely with the library's digital team. I'm actually going to have to get off here in just a few minutes to attend one of their data management courses. And they, if we don't help them with a data management plan, or they don't use DMP tool themselves, then the library's team helps them with the data management plan. It's an interesting idea, though, offering them space on that for research data that they might manage. Even if they were only using it as a staging area, to like help people get their data staged and then offload it using Globus or something, that could be perhaps really useful to them. And I will mention that to them. So did somebody ask, how did you arrive at the 2 terabyte? No, it was 20. Oh, okay.
Yes, Zoom
Yeah,
has
I said-
credits now.
I said $25, $25 per terabyte per year. And I think we basically just looked at the cost of bare drives. So yeah, like if you bought a bare drive, whatever, a terabyte level bare drive might be $125, and you'd expect a 5-year life out of it. So $25. It was something like that. The idea was to make it so cheap that people wouldn't even want to, like drive out to the big box store and get the storage. So any money that would come in would probably go to, to getting more storage put into it as it grows.
So
Okay, I
another,
hope I answered everyone's question. And as I said, I do have to go to get to this libraries thing
yes,
in a second.
Thanks,
Thank you.
David.
Everyone. Yeah.
just thanks.
Oh, yeah. You're welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. But Megan, another factor here is that Cumulo storage is expensive storage. So it's not fiscally feasible to keep everything on there either. That's the issue with on-prem things is like the really good fast storage is just too expensive to keep everything on. And at least my experience with the lower cost storage, like tape drives, for example, part of the reason that they're cheap is that they have a limit on the number of files that can actually be stored in them. which researchers never had to think about. So actually getting their data in the tape archive is a bit of a learning curve. So basically, kind of at least how Michigan set up their archive storage is like you'd get 100 terabytes of storage or 1 million files, whichever you reached first. So if your 1 million files was only 10 terabytes, then there's 90 terabytes that you're just can't use anymore because you used up your files. That's kind of the big issue with tape that I've seen.
And we had, back when we were in the spinning Rust days at Arizona, we had researchers who would basically use the file system as an inverted database. It didn't do that very well, but you had a folder with literally 10 million files in it, none of them over 5 bytes. And we had to finally put file limits on the file system. Is if you have X terabytes, you get Y files. You have to buy more terabytes if you want to do that, because buying more terabytes got more drives, which improved IOPS, which made the billions of tiny files less intolerable. And I never thought about it going to tape, but I can see the exact same thing there.
Right.
So Neil just shared one of the things we're actually looking at, and we've actually looked at over the years. So Globus again gets, I think, a common plug from a lot of us, being a good interface. Globus has a number of backend interfaces. It can speak S3. It can speak actually the DS3. That this SpectraLogic Black Pearl that Neil brought up can speak, but it does give you a direct path into a tape library, or into other storage. It doesn't have to be a tape, but it does deal with the files in a different way. But you have to still recognize it's going to tape. So when you're pushing your data out there, yes, there's some spinning disk to capture it, and it kind of makes it a little bit more seamless on that direction. But when you're pulling your data back out, there's a lag and a latency. One of the problems we really run into on the non-tape side, but I'll relate it back to the tape side, is that we worked hard for a lot of years trying to find as good of a value of a live active, I'm going to call it group storage space, as we could. Not scratch, but that we could give them at a good value. And then we turned around and tried to then make an archive space, and we found we couldn't really make an archive space cheaper than what we just did this group space for. And then when you go and offer the archive space for the same price as the group space, people are like, why would I want less access to my space? Just I'm going to buy more group space. And it just becomes the supersized USB drive in the corner. Although it has better characteristics, it still is a file system that can have corruption and data loss. And so we kind of succeeded at one thing and created a bigger problem in another thing, kind of in our own end. And then relating this back to the tape system, is we got to the point where you can approach the live storage system with fairly modest incremental costs, but to start a tape silo, you need a pretty reasonable starting point, a chunk of money. And then you hit kind of the stride where your growth and your ability to scale it out looks really nice financially. But our biggest problem right now is how to get started if we circle back to the Spectra Black Pearl with Globus or something else in front. So as many have noted, we are approaching the top of the hour. We do want to be mindful of people likely having a meeting minutes away. Are there any last minute comments, things anybody wants to share that we haven't been able to give time to yet? If not, then we do very much appreciate all the participation we've had today and for the good discussion that we've had. Well, we will wrap things up again. Thanks, everybody.